Our Lenten sermon series, Change, 7 words for Lent. We are talking about some of the words, the single words that can promote the most change in our lives if we really live into them and take them seriously. Last week we began with the word yes, and I told you then, and I tell you now, that in my mind, I am unfortunately much more of a no person. This comes naturally to me. It is often an internal no. Most of you would probably assume, well, John, he's so smiley and happy. He must be a very positive person. And it's an internal no. It's my gut reaction, not something that I voice all the time. And the reason for this is I am a 9 on the Enneagram. For those of you who may not be familiar, the Enneagram is a personality test. It's really fascinating to kind of see how these sociologists have figured us out internally. But a 9 on the Enneagram is also known as the peacemaker. As a peacemaker, I hate to tell anyone no. I don't like to rock the boat. I don't like to cause discord. I don't like to cause strife. I want everything to be even and easy. I want everybody to be happy, which makes it very hard to be United Methodist in the last few weeks because nobody's happy. So rather than just saying no, I typically respond with something that gives me a little bit more time and space, something like, let's talk about that, or let me think on that, or my children's least favorite word in the English language, maybe. Lucy and Maggie have cracked the code on that one. I give them a maybe, and they just go, that means no, let's go ask Mom. But if I'm not fast on my feet, I will say yes to everything, and I will be miserable rather than say no. But the good news is I'm growing up. I'm a big boy now as an adult. After 15 years of being a pastor, I am learning when to say no. It's a hard lesson to learn because the reality is that we get rewarded for saying yes, for being agreeable, for saying that, yes, we will, yes, I'd love to, yes, I'd be happy to. I remember in seminary, one of my professor saying, no church will ever reward you for saying no. No one will ever say that you're doing too much. No one will ever say that you're working too hard. No one will ever say you're too good at preaching. Could you scale it back a bit? No one will ever say that you visit the homebound enough. She said the church will take everything that you're willing to give them. The answer from the church will always be yes and more. Thank you sometimes. But no is not a bad word. In fact, if I don't say no, I have learned that I will burn out. I will stretch myself beyond the limits of my endurance. I will have health consequences, relational consequences with my family. I will sacrifice important, essential things that God is calling me to do for unessential things. A recent example. Many of you know that I have an open door policy with my office. If you come by the church any time and my door is open, it means that you're welcome to come in and interrupt whatever I'm doing. I can put it aside and we can sit down and chat and have a conversation. I try to be very available. But sometimes I have to, write a sermon every week. Sunday's coming. I have to make a phone call every once in a while. I have to talk to someone in private. Sometimes I just need to think. And I close my door. And you all open it. So I put up a sign on the little glass window, and it says, I have an open door policy. If it's open, you can come in. If it's closed, please, make an appointment, come back again. So I put up that sign, and then I learned that y'all will look around that sign to see if I'm in there. And then you'll knock and you'll open it. So I went to Lowe's, and I got a board, and I put that board up on the window, and I learned that if I put that board up on the window, you knock and you open the door anyway. So then I learned I have to turn off the lights and lock the door and pretend I'm not there and park my car around the corner, and you still come in, you rattle the doorknob. If I don't say no to the open door sometimes, important things can't get done. And before any of you think that I'm talking about you as an individual, it's not just you, trust me. It is all of you. I love you, I love you, I love you. Okay, I know that most of you are not pastors, but it's a common theme that I've heard from people over the last 15 years in every setting that I've served in. 21st century Americans know what it is to burn the candle at both ends, to feel like Everything is rushing toward you. You have so much on your plate. You're so busy. Your calendar to the end of your existence. You're exhausted by appointments and meetings and travel and practices and rehearsals. Your life is so full that you are probably neglecting some essential, important parts of your life. You're not eating the way that you should. You're not getting enough sleep. You can't find time to rest and recuperate. Your spiritual life is getting neglected. Your spouse, your kids, your relationships, the things that really matter to you are not getting the attention that they deserve. And listen, the church is not innocent of this. The church has asked far too much of too many people for far too long. After all that you need to do to be a good Christian is worship on Sunday, go to Sunday school, bring food to the potluck, bring your kids to every youth ministry and children's ministry event, support the fundraiser, give 10% of your income, go to a small group, go to a meeting, serve on a committee, invite your neighbor, coworker, or classmate to church, give above and beyond your tithe, come to another meeting, sing in the choir, play in the band, be an usher, greeter, come to Wednesday night dinner, chaperone, mow the grass, study scripture, pray, serve the less fortunate, we're Methodist, one more meeting. Oh, and work full-time and exercise and eat well and make time for your spouse and your children. Yeah. And some churches will lay a healthy dose of guilt on you if you don't do all those things with incredible excellence. Thankfully, we're not that kind of church. If you're going to do any of these things, some of this, just part of it, you have to learn to say no to some of it. Our scripture reading this morning is about King David, who certainly had his faults and his sins in his life, but is lifted high as an example of a faithful person. And God speaks of him as someone who has an upright heart or a person of integrity. And David asked that God give him an undivided heart. That tells me a whole heart, a heart that's geared toward one place. And that's what integration means. It comes from the math term integer. It's a whole number. It's a whole thing. And that's what we're looking for, isn't it? That's what we want. We want wholeness. We want a sense of purpose and direction, that our lives are on, that we're going in the right direction, that we can express the fullness of who God made us to be, the wholeness of who God is calling us to be. And wholeness and integrity means that we're putting all the parts of who we are behind that same purpose. But what we practice in modern American culture is a very divided life. The divided life is not the one we want. So how do we know when to say no to something? This comes about from being aware of our purpose and our identity. It's about knowing who we are and what we are called to do. It's one of the reasons we just went through this process together as a church of developing a new mission statement so that we could learn what we're about, so we can know what to say yes and what to say no to. We believe that Jesus Christ is the example of how we are called to live. Jesus was clear about his purpose and his mission during his life and the ministry that we have recorded in the Gospels. One of the church phrases that we use all the time is that we're called to lead a Christ-like life. And if that's true, that means that sometimes we're going to say no. Because guess what? Sometimes Jesus said no. When his ministry first started, he said no to temptation. He said no to the crowd sometimes and slipped away to deserted places because he needed rest. He needed time to pray. He said no to religious leaders. He said no to people in power. He said no, so sometimes he could just go and take a nap in a boat. One of my favorite new authors, Sano Nyquist, writes in her book, Present Over Perfect, about her tendency to say yes to everything. But she says that as she learned to say no, saying no became the scalpel as I remade my life. I love that image of a scalpel. This is not a machete. This is not an axe. A scalpel requires care and precision. It's very sharp. You have to be careful how you use it. If you've ever used an X-Acto knife or a scalpel, you know that sometimes it's so sharp that you can cut yourself and not even realize you did it. So what are the important places where you can begin the process of carefully, prayerfully saying no in your life and cutting away some of that which is denying you your identity and your purpose. I'm going to give you a couple examples of places where we can begin the process of saying no. One of the single most important places we can say no is saying no to crossing boundaries. All the big, bad things in our lives, the sins we commit, the things that we find ourselves and we wonder, how did I ever get here? How did I ever make the mistake? I can't believe I did this. All of that typically happens, not all at once, but in a series of small boundaries that we cross in succession that get us to a place where we don't even know how we got there. You let a series of small boundaries get crossed, and you find yourself crossing a big boundary. This is where addiction begins, where adultery begins, where relationships get distant and suffer. Because it seems okay in the beginning because you're just crossing one little boundary. It's just one little thing. It's not that big a deal until it becomes a behemoth that you can't control and people get hurt. Our Vice President, Mike Pence, often gets laughed at for not meeting with women alone as a rule in his life, which I think is a boundary that he and his wife set in their marriage. And if you set a boundary in your marriage and your relationships, those are good things to keep. It's important for us to set boundaries so that we know where the edges of where we should be are. And if we continue to say no, that gives us integrity by saying that I always hold this as a rule for myself and I won't cross the boundary. We also have to say no to relational overload. I know that you think you can, but you cannot manage as many relationships as you would like. Again, we look to the example of Jesus. Jesus had 12 friends, 12 guys that he hung around with all the time. And among those 12 guys, he had 3 that were close friends. Peter, James, and John were his closer inner circle. He didn't treat everyone equally. Some people got more of him, more of his time, more of his teaching, more of his life. There's a study that said that at the average funeral, there are 10 people who will cry. 10 people will cry at your funeral. Why are you continuing to manage relationships that in the long run are not the ones that really matter? Think about who is really close to you in your life. Who's going to be there when times get hard? Who's going to love you? Who's going to be there? Who's going to show up at the hospital or at your bedside? Your college drinking buddy probably isn't going to be there. Your seat buddy on the bus from 4th grade? Probably not. You certainly don't need to maintain relationships with ex-boyfriends and ex-girlfriends. You can refer back to Don't Cross Boundaries. How much time are you investing in people that aren't going to be there for you when you need them? And I'm talking about something as simple as how much time do you spend on Facebook maintaining relationships with people that you never see while your spouse and your children are sitting in the same room with you? How much time are you investing in relationships where the most you will ever get when you post something about how hard life is praying? Invest in relationships that matter, that mean something to you. Say no to activity overload. The great calendar crisis of the 21st century. I can't speak for all people, but I know that parents out there find themselves at the end of their rope from too many activities. You've got practices and camps and trips and rehearsals and performances and clubs and activities. Add in a few things that you might want to do with your life, and it becomes tough to make everything fit. Sometimes you need to say no. No, I can't make it. I have a personal appointment with myself, and that appointment is for a nap. Sometimes you need to tell your children, I know that you are super passionate about playing the bassoon right now, but you were super passionate 3 to 6 weeks ago about cheerleading, and we're going to finish that super passionate thing before we start a new one, okay? Let's finish the last thing you started before we start something new. How many nights a week are you away from home? Are you away from the table together sharing in a meal. All the things that you're trying to do to make your child well-rounded or get your youth into the right college, maybe at the expense of your and their sanity and your relationships. So sometimes you have to say no to a few activities. This is an important one, saying no to causes outside your calling. You are not called to everything. Just because someone else in your circle is super passionate about something doesn't mean that you have to be too. That can be sports, music, prison ministry, youth ministry, Kiwanis, Civitan, ASPCA, Boy Scouts, Emmaus, International Missions. None of these things are bad things. In fact, they are quite good and they do great work, but they may not be where your heart is. It's okay to say, I appreciate your invitation, but I'm really focused on this right now. This is who I'm called to be. Now that works if you know what you're passionate about. You don't get to say no to everything, because guess what? If you say no to everything, you're never going to know. There is a time and a season for us to say yes and explore and ask questions and see where it is that God might be calling us to use our gifts and talents. But once you found that thing, once you found that place of your heart that really sings, it's okay to say no to the other things and say, this is what I am called to do. And sometimes you just have to say no to yourself. This is no to the things that we know are harmful to ourselves, but it's also a no to believing our own hype, to thinking that we are more important than we actually are. I do this from time to time. I'm the pastor of a church. I get the sense that I'm very needed and necessary and important. Early in our marriage, when the phone rang and someone was in the hospital, I was putting on my shoes and dropping everything and heading out the door before I knew what was happening. And Denise, my lovely, talented, amazing wife, would say to me, I know that they're in the emergency room, but is this an emergency? Why don't you stay here and finish dinner with your family? Because you know he or she's still going to be in the emergency room in 45 minutes. And in those moments, I would realize I am not as important or as necessary as I thought I was. I didn't have to drop everything, because when I do that, I'm neglecting the most important relationships in my life. What do you need to say no to? I know when we hear this word, as I was telling the children before, it can make it sound like God is a God of deprivation, especially as we're here in Lent. We're talking about fasting and giving things up for Lent. But we don't worship a God of deprivation. We worship a God of abundance. But we're looking for the abundance of the good things in our lives, not just adding unnecessary parts to us, not just pulled in 1,000 directions. No, God wants us to have a lot of good and wonderful, life-affirming, helpful things. But if we're going to have those, it means that we are going to have to prayerfully, carefully, tenderly, from time to time, look one another in the eyes and say,